morning everybody. On behalf of the Conference Planning Committee and the Board of Trustees, I am honoured and delighted to warmly welcome you to the PCPLD Annual Conference 2021. I'm Gemma Allen and I'm Chair of the PCPLD Network. Today's programme is rich with amazing keynote speakers for you, abstract authors and clips from our friends at the Grassroots Group. We will be reflecting on the challenges of this past year, highlighting good practice, innovation and the latest research around palliative and end-of-life care and learning disabilities. Please do make the most of interacting with us and with your colleagues throughout today. The chat box facility is open, so post any questions or any comments that you have in there, and we will be picking some of these questions out to discuss at the end of the day. If you're on Twitter, then please use the hashtag PCPLD. I sincerely hope that you enjoy today's conference and find it valuable to both your current and future practice. I'm now going to hand over to our two chairs for today's conference. Both faces will be extremely familiar to PCPLD network members. Professor Irena Tuffy-Weiner is one of our trustees and has also chaired most of our online webinars over the past 12 months. Peter Allen is a member of our Specialist Advisory Group and also the Grassroots Group. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Irena and Peter. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Peter Allen. I am a member of the Specialist Advisory Group of the PCPLD network, and I am your chair for today, together with Irena.
Hello, and I'm Irena Tuffy-Weiner, and it's just such an honour and a delight to be chairing this together with you today, Peter. Wonderful to be in the same room. Yeah, we haven't been able to do that in this COVID year, so it's lovely to be sitting next to you. In fact, when we decided we'd do it together, you were so excited. You did a wonderful picture. Shall I show it to you?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So this is what Peter made. I hope you can see this. PCPLD network, it says.
Yeah.
That's to kick off this conference, so thank you for that. Now, as Gemma said, we are completely delighted to see so many of you here. You are in for a wonderful day of exciting and inspirational speakers. If you've been following our webinars during this past year, you will know that we tried to cram in lots of different speakers in a short space of time. Today we have a bit more time, and that means that we've been able to give our keynote speakers, in particular, a bit longer to share their wisdom with us.
The theme for today is finding the gaps and closing the gaps. We want to think about what is going well for people with learning disabilities at the end of life. If things are not going well, we want to think about how we can make things better.
And we really do want to think about it very carefully, isn't it, how things can be made better. And we can often do that also through hearing from when things go well. So today we'll hear lots of examples of good practice and inspirational ideas. I'll hope you take something away from that. We really want to hear from everybody, as if one thing has been shown to us this past year is that nobody can make things better on their own. And therefore, Peter.
Yes, and it's really important that our voices are heard. The voices of people with learning disabilities. That's why I'm going to start today's conference with listening to the Grassroots Group. And I am part of this group. We meet to talk about death and dying. We have been helping the PCPLD network with year's webinars. Here are some things that we have said and done.
Introducing the Grassroots Group. We meet every month. During the pandemic, we have been meeting on Zoom. We think and talk about dying and how we feel about it.
I went to a funeral I did, but we had to watch it on the computer by Zoom, and it's quite difficult it was because you couldn't be at the funeral, but you can. I felt like I wanted to go through the computer and to give the lady a hug I did, because I knew her and all that. You know, I just wanted to go and give her a hug, because she was just sitting there just for her and the daughter. Yes, it was quite emotional not being able to go to a funeral and to be able to be there and to give your friend a hug. That's it. Yes.
Sometimes we look at pictures using books beyond words.
Amanda?
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether, because I don't think she's alive. I think she's died. And you can see the drip. It's not connected to her, and the nurse is pulling up the sheet.
Yeah.
So I think she has died.
The picture clearly states to me that sadly the patient has died. You know, it's really upsetting to see. Really, it's amazing the emotional effects it can have on you. Really, it's you know, the power of the pictures. It's amazing. You know how it can affect you. You know what I mean?
We have used art to think about what matters to us and what we want when we die. We campaigned for people with learning disabilities to get priority for the COVID vaccine. The BBC News got in touch and interviewed us.
You know, you can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't hear it. It's like a silent killer.
Everyone here has a learning disability.
You could end up in hospital.
They meet up regularly to talk about and understand death and bereavement.
It's scary at times.
These chats have never been more important.
All I keep thinking is, am I going to be next? You know what I mean? Am I going to be the next one to die?
I would hate to be in the hospital and end up dying on my own.
Just because we've got a learning disability doesn't mean we should sit in the corner and rot, and then our loved ones get a phone call to say that we've passed away. We need help now.
The amount of people that have died is absolutely frightening.
We need it now. There are so many people that are going to die, and it's not fair.
Then afterwards, the government changed its mind and we could all get the vaccine. We were so proud of having spoken up. And finally, we helped with PCPLD network webinars. And in June, we took over completely.
How has it been for you seeing people dying of COVID?
Your mum's really sick, she may not survive, and then half an hour later they're phoned back and say, actually, your dad's now really sick as well and he may not survive. I think that's
it makes you question whether you're doing the best you can for people under the circumstances.
My dad died during the pandemic, so I had so I'm one of those people that's had that experience, which has been hard.
Has the pandemic made you think more about death and dying?
Yeah, I think it has actually, Rick. I think that's partly what I was struggling with a bit mentally when we were going through the pandemic. It sounds utterly ridiculous, but I'm still not over the death of my cat. And I lost my cat 12 years ago. They were some of the best questions I've ever been asked in an interview.
and we have fun. Would you like to join us? We welcome new members this autumn. Email Irena info@pcpld.org.
Oh, Peter, that was great to see all the things that you've done with the grassroots group. Yeah, wasn't it? And it's always really good to listen to you and to all our friends and advisors in grassroots. So thank you for that. So do you want to now introduce the first plenary speaker?
Sure. It is a real pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Talbot. He is a full-time NHS consultant in palliative medicine and an honorary professor at Cardiff University School of Medicine.
And Mark is interested in advanced care planning, acute palliative care and DNA CPR decision making. And Peter, I'm really looking forward to this because Mark has given a TED talk, for example. He has written for international news outlets like the Washington Post, where his article was their top pick for 2019. So I think this is going to be good.
Professor Talbot's talk is called Igam Ogam. That's Welsh, but I'm not sure what it means.
Neither am I.
The talk is about experiences of advanced care planning during the pandemic. Over to you, Professor.
Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Mark Talbot. I'm a palliative care consultant. I work in Wales, and I'm currently recording in a library in the hospital that I work at. So I'm in a private room in the library, but if there's noise or someone coming in or something like that, apologies in advance. I hope I've booked the room for the time, but you never know. So very nice to be here today. Shame I can't see you, but I've made myself available for a conversation later on in the day as well. So you might want to take some note of some of the things I say and yeah, get involved and talk to me and perhaps establish a connection. I've called this presentation Igam Ogam. I work in Wales, and Igam Ogam is a Welsh term for not quite walking in a straight line. This is a holiday photo from a few years ago, which sort of demonstrates that a little bit. And very much open to your own interpretation in terms of how you want to see that. I think all of us sometimes don't walk in quite a straight line, and there's sometimes little areas of confusion, and sometimes we walk in a certain direction and find it isn't quite the right way and have to come back again. And I think that's certainly been my experience with advanced care planning and DNA CPR, for instance. So I'm All Wales lead for strategy setting for DNA CPR, for advanced care planning, for future care planning, and I lead a reasonably big group of people. We get together every 2 months and discuss some of the latest issue guidance and advice and videos and information material as well. It's called the Advanced and Future Care Planning Group for Wales, and we report to the End of Life Care Strategy Board and to the Deputy CMO for Wales as well. So advanced care planning is certainly on the agenda. Of course, we were very concerned during the pandemic about some of the practice that was going on and some of the stories that we were hearing from Wales, but also from England as well, in terms of the things that had happened there, and the sort of widespread use of blanket policies and forms and discrimination that was going on certainly caused some concerns. Prior to the COVID pandemic, we had set out that we would meet 4 times a year, and during the pandemic, some meetings now were happening twice a month, and we got together to discuss some of these issues. And talking about these areas of discrimination. We found that there were reports of high numbers of DNA CPR orders and decisions, especially in learning disability groups, for instance. In Wales, we have an all Wales DNA CPR policy in which it is very clearly set out, even before the pandemic, that discrimination isn't on. But of course, what happened in the pandemic and what happened with people's thinking and their approaches towards things perhaps wasn't always based on policy and what was happening. So caused a huge amount of concern, especially to me, because I hold these areas dear and I work with a lot of people in this area. I'm a practicing clinician as well, and so I talk to a lot of people who have learning disabilities and, for instance, other long-term conditions such as cancer or metastatic cancer. And of course, it is all very important and very bespoke, every individual conversation. But I bring it back to, our DNRs or DNA CPRs, or, are these forms and these advanced care plans, are they principally evil, or do they exist for a good purpose? And you might say, of course, Mark is going to say now that there's a good purpose for them and that they should exist and that they should be there. He would say that because he's an all-Wales strategy lead for it. I would say I wish I lived in a world where we didn't have to set out these plans in such detail, and it was all a bit easier and a bit more straightforward to say what you want and then it happens. Unfortunately, when it comes to these complexities, it doesn't quite work that way. The same way as people have, birth plans before they give birth, and those areas are sometimes laid out in exact detail in terms of what people want, what they wouldn't want. I feel sometimes don't prepare for our own deaths. Everyone who's watching this, including myself, will die. We will die at some point, and there's no way out of that. You can have no DNA CPR form, we can have 20 DNA CPR forms and 14 advanced care plans. Doesn't change the fact you're going to die. And I find often those people who have thought about it a lot, have discussed it with their family a lot, are probably those most likely inclined to have done a will, have made a plan, have set out perhaps an advanced decision to refuse treatment, or set out someone who's a lasting power of attorney for them for health and welfare, or for property to help make decisions when they can't make decisions themselves anymore. So should they just be banned for everyone or just for people with a learning disability? I think the answer to that is no. I think people with a learning disability will sometimes have cancers and will have metastatic cancers and have really long-term conditions that could potentially lead to a significant deterioration in the next months or even years, and actually precluding them from having these very sometimes difficult but sometimes very mature conversations about what would you want if you were admitted to hospital, what would happen in that scenario. Would you want this treatment? Would you want IV antibiotics? Would you want blood transfusions? Is an important question to ask in a very bespoke way. In Wales, we have an all Wales policy for DNA CPR, and for decision making, we also have an all Wales website and patient information materials as well. It's actually been in existence since 2015, and we've been working on updates ever since. So this is what it sort of looks like if you go to the wales.nhs.uk/DNA CPR or wales.nhs.uk/AFCP websites, AFCP standing for Advanced and Future Care Planning. Then you get some of these resources, which some of them have been created by patients, videos by patients, information materials about the topics, and why, for instance, they considered making an advanced care plan and what made their mind up to potentially say no to a potential future treatment, etc. But we also at the very beginning of this did an equality impact assessment, looked at the different protected characteristics and said, how do we address it for these different protected characteristics, for instance, on the issue of issuing someone or giving someone a DNA CPR form, for instance, discussing with them and what needs to be in place to make sure it is all done correctly. And so, yeah, we looked at some of the research involved and what was involved and how some people with longer term conditions or learning disabilities might have other conditions and what that meant in terms of how we could approach it, how open conversations could be held, and what the barriers were to these open conversations. I must say, I've worked in healthcare for over 20 years, and there's obviously you meet a lot of people who can be quite significantly unwell, and often the worst time to talk to them about these topics is when they're really deteriorating and getting more unwell. Actually, it's sometimes better when I approach these topics when someone is improving and they're a little bit better, but then I might say, next time you admitted to hospital, would you do it all the same way again, or are there certain things you would want or certain things you wouldn't want? And by doing that, I kind of explore their wishes, and that's then regardless of what their underlying conditions or problems might be. So there was a big engagement exercise that happened at the start of the All Wales DNA CPR policy. Key themes included needing to ensure that appropriate next of kin and proxy are recognized in the care and treatment of an individual, that their voice counts, effective, accessible and kind and sensitive communication and information to ensure that these issues are understood, because they're quite complex issues. I mean, I'm still learning on the topic of DNA CPR and advanced care planning. So what chance is there for someone who isn't such an expert on the topic to be fully briefed on what the information and what all the areas involved? There isn't much. So if there isn't good information available, then what hope is there? So I've worked with a lot of people with learning disabilities who happen to be very good on the internet and able to find information very quickly, and they showed me some of the information they had retrieved about the topic of advanced care planning. I happen to think it wasn't particularly relevant perhaps to the UK, maybe it had been an Australian site or something like that, and then I was able to redirect them to some of the Welsh resources and the things that we have here, and they were quite happy with that, and they looked through those and found the medium that best suited them. The internet can be very good for that sometimes, because maybe you're not someone who likes to go through a long document, a PDF file with 185 pages and bullet points. I'll include myself in that assessment, but you'd rather watch a 5-minute video summarizing that document, or an audio, or even a podcast where some people are talking to each other. Maybe this video, will be made accessible, and I can link to it for some of the people that I work with, for instance, and they may prefer that to reading the All Wales patient information leaflet that we've created, for instance. So non-judgmental approach, but really creating so many resources and really saturating the resources market, so every bespoke person, every individual can have a way of accessing this information. What I found a few years ago when I did a bit of research on this and in practice as well, is that information on what CPR actually involves and how successful it is lacking. So, a lot of people watch popular television programs, and some of the portrayals on those television programs haven't necessarily done anything to help educate people on how unsuccessful CPR can be. We may see footballers on football pitches surviving CPR, but who of us is as fit as a 22-year-old footballer, for instance, and what other factors come into it? So CPR itself is a highly selective procedure, if you think about it, and if people have several long-term conditions, then its success can be quite poor. However, if you opt out of CPR, it doesn't mean that you don't get all the treatments that come before CPR, before your heart and breathing have stopped. So it's really about opting out of one treatment that is particularly unsuccessful at the time, but where a snap decision has to be made by an arriving clinician to quickly give you this treatment or not. And they often will default to giving you the treatment, even if it's unlikely to succeed. So this is just a Guardian article that I wrote a few years ago on that topic to help educate some of the people I work with and some of the students I work with. But quickly it became more popular, and more people from all walks of life started commenting on it and sharing it, because it's one of the first times that someone had sort of openly said, hang on a moment, this procedure is given by default to pretty much everyone, but actually the success rates are really, really low. So do people really have the information to say, no, this is something that I wouldn't want considered in my healthcare in the future, or not? And the information has to be updated on a regular basis as well. So the consumer website has a section on advanced care planning and DNA CPR, and they kindly let me add some resources and some edits to it as well, and some of the inconsistency. You'll have heard that I don't like the term DNR very much, because do not resuscitate is a different term to do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation is that specific treatment of electric shocks, compressions to the chest, airways, and really quite a brutal, fast-paced regimen of things to try and get your heart, which is already stopped, back into a beating mode again. General resuscitation can involve, giving someone fluids when they're really dehydrated, or giving them a blood transfusion, and that's very different. So general resuscitation is for everyone who might need it, but CPR in particular, this unsuccessful, often treatment, is perhaps not something that everyone would want to have considered in their care. And so for me, that applies to everyone. So whether there's a learning disability or not, I think if someone has a learning disability and has a really advanced cancer that is spread to everywhere in the body, then I will be honest with them, and I'll say the opinion that I have is that CPR wouldn't work, but that doesn't mean you wouldn't be eligible for all the other treatments like chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and various other things. And then they can make their mind up, and I can give them the resources to make their mind up in terms of whether they agree with me or whether they disagree with my view, and then we can have a further discussion on the topic. So there was an important court case, the so-called Tracy ruling, where it was felt that it was important to have these DNA CPR discussions very openly, and talk to people about them when they were being put in place. Of course, some people said, well, what if a person doesn't want to have those conversations, or when actually having those conversations might cause psychological harm? And I have worked with people with learning disabilities where they and those close to them, around them, have said, no, this would really cause quite significant psychological harm. We feel that if you bring these topics of, what would happen around the time of death and dying up, it will really, really cause extreme harm, and you shouldn't hold this conversation. The judges said, should it be distress alone? So everyone might find it not very nice having such a conversation, but that's just a short-term feeling. And still the discussion should be had. You should bring it up. So balancing between, am I causing distress to someone versus am I causing long-term psychological or physical harm to a person, it is very difficult. And I often take the view of the person, but also their carers, their proxy, their next of kin into account when I'm making a judgment. I'll usually default towards having the discussion openly, but I might start it by saying, look, I'm going to talk about something now that not everyone likes to talk about, and you stop me anywhere. And if you don't want to continue talking, you tell me. And then I build in lots of questions to say, are you okay to continue talking about this, or do you want to stop now? And sometimes people will take me up on that and say, please stop now. I really find this conversation very, very difficult. I don't want to talk about it any further. And then I might say, okay, I won't continue with it. Would it be okay to talk about it at another point, or do you never want to talk about it again? So those are some of the ways that I approach it, and that often makes the person who I'm having the conversation with feel very much in control of the conversation. And most people do actually have questions and actually strong opinions on the topic as well. We also should have a clear and accessible policy, which I feel we have in Wales, because we've got a national policy. England don't have a national policy, but don't tell anyone. But we have one in Wales. England have different policies in different areas, and I think Scotland have a national policy as well. We've worked with Scotland on their policy as well. And so as an advanced and future care planning group for Wales, we have oversight, as I said before, about the advanced care planning processes and forms in Wales, and take suggestions. We've co-opted onto our group Rhian Davis, who's the CEO of Disability Wales. COVID-19 has had a big impact on people already facing inequality and discrimination, and she's updated us on that. In Wales, we have Welsh Senedd, so politicians with powers to make decisions within Wales, and Jane Hutt chairs the Disability Equality Forum. And I've spoken to Jane Hutt in the past about some of these issues, and she's managed to garner some evidence from me on this. But a report was commissioned on the impact of COVID-19 on disabled people, included 300 pieces of evidence on how COVID had affected people with learning disabilities as well. And I found that there had been a huge inconsistency regarding decision making. Disabled people felt access to medical services were disrupted. Only 15% felt their rights were being upheld, which is really concerning. DNA CPR had understandably caused a lot of concern. There was joint statements by the Chief Medical Officer for Wales and Chief Nursing Officer for Wales, as well as from Care Inspectorate Wales and Healthcare Inspectorate Wales. And they reinforced the rights of disabled people and clarifying the position that no discriminatory practices should be allowed in relation to DNA CPR notices, and that conversations must be held with all those involved, and that they shouldn't be based on protected characteristic such as religion, gender, ethnic background, etc. And those with learning difficulties felt learning disabilities fed back that they found the intervention by the CMO helpful, and the Welsh Government considering the findings of the report. In our All Wales DNA CPR policy as well, we make mention of this. We don't make too special mention of this because we don't feel it should be a segregated group or a special group. We feel that everyone, including those with a learning disability, should be treated in the same way. But no one should be discriminated against in any shape or form. And it really depends not on whether someone has a learning disability, but what their long-term conditions are and what actually their risk of requiring CPR in the immediate future might be. So so we talk about these discussions and that they should be held and offered. So I always make it clear that some people don't want to have these discussions about advanced care planning and DNA CPR. And we've made it clear in the policy that they should be never forced on individuals and based on individual situations and never made in a discriminatory fashion. And we've based a lot of our policy on the reports that are already out there, either specifically for Wales or for the United Kingdom in general. So we focus on when we as clinicians feel that CPR in future might not work, or there might be a chance that it might be offered by default. Take the statistics, for instance. In a meta-analysis, it was found that people with metastatic cancer, so cancer that had started in one part of the body and then spread to other parts of the body, rarely left hospital after receiving CPR. Only 1.8% of those people left hospital. And those that remained often had longer term disabilities as well that were added on because of the CPR, or they might have short-term problems such as severe pain or fractured ribs, for instance. Opting out of future CPR for those people does not preclude them from all other interventions. And I think we've launched a really successful campaign, education campaign in Wales over the last years, that a DNA CPR form doesn't mean that you can't have all the other treatments that might be on offer. It really only pertains to the specific treatment that has to be made. Decisions have to be made very quickly in an instant, whether you're going to give CPR or not give CPR. And a person-led approach on all these things. In our policy, we have this sort of schematic framework for DNA CPR decision-making, so it makes it very clear when and why you might actually think about a DNA CPR discussion with a person and with a patient. So nothing to do with any learning disabilities or anything like that. It really is, the trigger is when you think that it might be likely that someone is facing a natural, anticipated and accepted death in the nearer future, and that might occur. And again, as I said earlier on in this presentation, we need to get better at discussing and talking about these issues, about all our deaths and what's going to happen. I've worked very closely with the patient liaison group in the hospital, and they've helped me with some concept, but also they are keen to sort of express that patients sometimes need to initiate these conversations or may want to initiate these conversations, and actually come to their doctor or their nurse and say, look, I want to have a talk to you about this topic. It's something that I've thought about a lot, and here's my views. What do you think, basically? So that it's a two-way process rather than always the doctor coming in with a sort of slightly shifty face and saying, oh, I need to talk to you about something that isn't particularly pleasant to talk about, and starting the conversation that way. Just to sort of recap at the minute, so we've got an All Wales policy, and such decisions must be discussed with patients or those close to them unless they have indicated they do not want to have these discussions, or it might actually cause psychological or physical harm. And when we write in our notes, or if we write onto these forms, it should be very clear if we think that harm might be caused. And we should base all of this on our local or our national policies when we're having these conversations and noting them down. So how to have better discussions about this is something I try and answer, most weeks. And I have a lot of these conversations, including with people with learning disabilities. And I think sometimes it goes better than other times. I think some people want to have these conversations, other people find them very difficult and very hard. And so it's never quite right. And, I might never be far away from next week having a conversation and it goes terribly wrong and someone misunderstands me. And we're also not particularly good at predicting when someone might deteriorate. And I'm often honest with that, with my patients, and say, I don't know what's around the corner, but at some point it might be good to have this conversation. And it may be good for those who are close to you, your loved ones and your friends, to hear that conversation so that they've got a better idea of what sort of person you are and what you might want in a situation where, you might be heavily supported by machinery. Would you want feeding tubes? Would you want this type of intervention, et cetera, in the future? And advanced care plans can help you think about those different scenarios if you want to. So we've created videos. We've created videos for healthcare professionals. We've created videos for patients. The videos for healthcare professionals were made with patients and actually scripted by patients as well. Alan Buckle here in the foreground, for instance, slightly faded, was one of the people who helped us script these videos. Just a little interesting quiz fact here in the middle: are DNA CPR forms legally binding? No, they are not. They're not legally binding. They're advisory only, so they might be in the notes and they are advisory for the new clinician who may come in, but they're not legally binding. Whereas if you as a patient or person have filled in a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare, and before you became incapacitated and you refused life-sustaining treatments within it, then that is legally binding and has to be abided by. And of course, all the things I'm talking about now are more about treatment refusals. So DNA CPR forms and advanced care plans are more about what someone wouldn't want. You can, in an advanced care plan, state what you would want, but that doesn't have to be enacted necessarily. But you could put, I'm the sort of person who would consider having a feeding tube put in, for instance. You can put that in, but it isn't legally enforceable just from that care plan. Whereas a refusal in an advanced decision to refuse treatment document is very much legally enforceable if you've specified that. And so, yes, I've talked a lot about learning disability and, for instance, autism, and that those should never be things that you find alone on such forms, and that shouldn't happen. And we've been very clear on that in Wales. Again, as I sort of alluded to before, the procedure of CPR itself is quite highly selective and discriminatory if you want to look at it, if you want to look at its success rates. And if you're interested in the literature, that I've summarized the paper that actually sort of says that, sort of you compare a young 20-year-old footballer to, someone perhaps my age, for instance, and already the outcomes are very, very different. And if you throw in a few healthcare conditions, or if you throw in a few things that affect the lungs or the kidneys, for instance, then the successes are again very, very different. But without knowing all these things, how can you express a view on CPR or even DNA CPR? You might think that all CPR is as successful as you've seen on the football pitch during the European Championships, but of course that isn't the case. And if you don't have those conversations and ask the questions, then you don't know. So it just shouldn't be a taboo subject, I feel. We worked with some art students at Falmouth University. I told them some of these issues and how we're really desperately trying to get better ways and forms and mediums of communicating this area, not just writing a patient information leaflet and handing it out to patients and then no one ever reads it, but also videos and YouTubes and Vimeos and things like that. And they produced a wonderful stop frame animation video for me, which they've also narrated. And if you want to look at it, you can find it on YouTube. If you type "talk CPR" into YouTube, you should find all these videos. And this is one of them. And I was very proud of them in terms of the work that they had done on this and how they'd understood the points that I felt were important. And so, yeah, I don't go in particularly when I hold these conversations with people with a particular agenda. What I do try and do is make it very bespoke to each individual. And if they may have a learning disability, for instance, then I may sort of try and find out what their preferred method of communication is and how they want to talk to me, and if they like to have resources before they talk to someone to find out a bit more information. And we've created those resources, and I'll show you a few of those soon. But, you know, the question of what matters most to you is actually quite a good general question, especially towards the end of life. What matters to you? What are the things that are important to you? And when you talk about all of those, then sometimes CPR and other things can come up, but they don't become the main topic of conversation necessarily. What goals do you have? Any opinions on treatments you wouldn't want? May seem strange for me to bring this up now that you're feeling a bit better, but what would you do differently next time you come into hospitals? All those things can be ways of looking at these things. And, you know, I often suggest to people that they might want to consider having a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare who helps make decisions when you haven't got the ability or the capacity anymore to do so, someone you trust, or writing an advanced decision to refuse treatment, which specifies a lot of the areas that you might be concerned about or treatments that you wouldn't want. So I'm going to take you through some of the resources as well. We've worked very closely with View an Hour, and they're called now Compassionate Cymru in Wales, and also worked with Dying Matters and Macmillan and various other groups to produce some of these videos and some of these resources. The Talk CPR videos, hopefully very good, and lots of people have fed back very positively on those. And, you know, some people just prefer watching videos rather than, as I said, reading a 32-page policy document. And advancedcareplan.org.uk, which has lots of videos on what to do and how to even start the process of making an advanced care plan. And then we've got the more formal sort of wales.nhs.uk/DNA CPR site, which has a lot of the policy stuff on it. Again, lots of bullet points here, which you might be less interested in. Some people like this. They like to have a sort of bullet pointed approach in terms of what we've changed and what we said about discrimination within the sort of practice of writing advanced care plans. But other people might prefer watching a video. There's me in a video here embedded in the website, waxing lyrical about the changes and what to do and what not to do. But also having patient resources on there for different people and the ways that they want to access this information, including, things for people who have visual impairments and want to hear it read out. So we've made that available, including in Welsh as well. And also when doctors and nurses and allied healthcare professionals fill in these forms, we've actually changed the form that they have to fill in, what discussions they have held with the patient. And we want a bit of detail on that because we want to know what has been said to the patient, what has been said to those close to the patient as well. We've changed it that sometimes doctors hold these conversations, but sometimes nurses or allied healthcare professionals are the first to hold these conversations, and all can actually record the conversations that they've had with you on these forms so that they can make it very clear. The forms can be given and are given to the patients themselves and those close to them. And on the reverse, they've got information on how to access this policy and how to access the patient resources of this policy, for instance, to find out a little bit more and ask further questions if they want to. We're lucky enough to work with a learning disability team in the Naryn-Bevan area, and they were so happy to help us and enthusiastic that they created some resources that we've added to our website as well for people who want to find out a little bit more. And yeah, so I often think back to a patient that I saw many years ago with advanced motor neuron disease, who lamented the fact that there was no all Wales resources for advanced care planning, including she was quite keen to have an advanced decision to refuse treatment, which she wanted to fill in herself and have witnessed as well, and which she wanted to refuse certain life-sustaining treatments. She also wanted to make it clear that she would want most other treatments, and we didn't have one at the time, but I'm pleased to say that now in Wales, we have an all Wales advanced decision to refuse treatment document and guidance notes as well, which you can access via our website. Here's a look of what some of the videos look like on the advancedcareplan.org.uk website, which are quite highly accessed. We've made those with some of our patients who've kindly given their time to speak on the videos in terms of why they wanted to do this and why it was important to them as well. And if you think, well, what's the evidence, Mark, that you've involved people in this journey? Then just managed to, just before the pandemic hit, hold a sort of all Wales national conference to which we invited a whole lot of patients and stakeholders and people from learning disability forums and also people with dementia, and they actually attended this conference, and we set out a plan and a strategy for what is needed for advanced and future care planning in Wales and what people want. So a lot of workshops were held, and sort of key themes were identified in terms of what was required of the different forms and the different information resources that are out there. This is just an example of the All Wales Advanced Decision to Refuse Treatment form and its guidance notes. They're available not just in Welsh, you'll be pleased to hear, but also in English, but in both languages, if you should so wish. And here's the link to some of these resources. So you've already mentioned the wales.nhs.uk/DNA-CPR website, but also the talkcpr.wales or talkcpr.com videos and the YouTube sites as well. We've even on our patient information leaflets got little QR codes. So for those of you who are really handy with your phones and you've got the little QR code scanners, I mean, I didn't have one until very recently, but then more and more places are asking for QR code scanners. But we've even got a sort of QR code for advanced care planning and DNA CPR, which takes you to the YouTube videos directly to help explain and discuss some of these complex issues. Some of you may be aware that the Care Quality Commission for England recently held an inquiry, and they felt that the quality of DNA CPR decision making hadn't been very good. Whilst they didn't find much evidence of blanket decision making for whole categories of patients in care settings during COVID-19, they found that DNA CPR decisions have been inadequately discussed with patients and next of kin, and documentation of discussion was actually lacking. And that's why we've made it very clear on the All Wales forms that these discussions should be noted down. They also felt that education and staff knowledge was very patchy, and this is something that I feel we constantly have to work on. So education forums like this one right now, but also regular forums and face-to-face meetings and discussions and links for healthcare staff to explain some of the issues of advanced care planning and DNA CPR are just incredibly important. And let's not forget cultural differences. I've seen lots of people from different cultures, including people with other religious backgrounds, with learning disabilities as well, and of course they have needs as well, and add to that the complexity of having to translate via sort of a translator, and it can get very, very complicated. But we've got information and resources in terms of other religions as well, in terms of what they say with regard to advanced care planning or DNA CPR as well. So I feel we've done our homework and done our research in Wales, but there's always more that can be done. So it's Igam Ogam, it's a long winding road, and I'm winding towards the end here now as well. I've gone in a sort of spiral route, as you will have seen during the presentation, but I hope you found it entertaining and interesting as well. But yes, the pandemic did highlight some poor practice. Learning disability and Down syndrome should never be on the DNA CPR form and just stand there. It shouldn't be. And at the same time, people with advanced illnesses like metastatic cancer should have all the options to talk about future deteriorations, whether they've got a learning disability or not. And it's just important to not discriminate in either way. So not preclude people from having those discussions, but also not force them to have discussions when it's really only a learning disability that they might have and not any other long-term condition or cancer, for instance. British Medical Association has recently updated its ethical guidelines for doctors and have said that decisions are based upon clinical factors related to outcome and not on discriminatory judgments. Health conditions or impairments unrelated to capacity to benefit clinically must not be used to guide decision making. I quite like the use of language that they've made there. It's quite helpful, and it's helpful in my teaching and my education as well. The presence, for example, of a learning disability would almost certainly not be a clinically relevant factor, and it isn't. And yeah, just to close, I just wonder whether there's a greater role for working closely with people from learning disability charities, for learning disability nurses and workers in hospitals and in the community as well, to have these conversations. And I'm sure this is a discussion that will be ongoing, but I'd like to put my hat in the ring and say that I think that would be a really important step. But yes, again, this is a slide that was created by one of the art students I worked with in Falmouth. I quite like to use it to end my my hopeless presentation. So I hope it wasn't too hopeless for you today, and that you found some of the information at least a little bit relevant. And yeah, if you are interested in coming forward and talking to Irene or to myself in terms of creating content or creating a video, for instance, about what is important to different people in different settings, then please come forward. I'm always interested in creating educational materials, podcasts, videos, etc., etc. I hope you found that useful. You can connect with me via Twitter if you're on Twitter. I don't do any other social media, unfortunately. My Twitter handle is Prof. Mark Taubert. And yeah, maybe I will see you there and hopefully see you a little bit later for the live question and answer session. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Mark Taubert, for a really interesting talk. And Mark is hopefully still with us at the end of the day for the Q&A session. So do put your questions and comments for him in the Q&A box, and we'll pick them up during the day and hopefully we'll be able to address them.
Our next speaker is David Harling, who is Head of Learning Disability Nursing at NHS England and NHS Improvement.
And David is a learning disability nurse and a mental health nurse with over 30 years of experience, has held senior roles at local, regional and national level, and he's been involved in the development of national policies and strategies.
David thinks it is very important that people with learning disabilities are equal partners. I'm very happy to hear that. He believes in co-production, and he told us he writes songs in his spare time.
Writing songs, yeah, he might sing to us. I don't think so, though. I think they'll just listen to his talk, which I'm sure is going to be really inspirational. It's called Assuring the Valuable Contribution of Learning Disability Nursing in Palliative Care. So, David, over to you now.
Good morning, everybody. My name's David Harling, and I am the Head of Learning Disability Nursing in the National Nursing Directorate of NHS England and Improvement. And I'm going to talk today about the contribution of learning disability nurses in the area of palliative care. I'm extremely pleased to be invited along today, not least because we have such an amazing agenda of guest speakers and areas to be considered as part of their presentations, but also from the point of view of you as attendees to this event and the difference that you're making in your day-to-day working lives. So in many ways, I want to offer a thank you for that. I'm a learning disability nurse by background. I'm also a mental health nurse, and prior to coming into the national role, I've always worked in clinical practice. I still have direct links to clinical practice. I still supervise some colleagues and offer mentorship as well, but my passion has always been learning disability nursing and remains so. In terms of the challenges that people with learning disabilities and their family members face, we absolutely know this does continue, sadly, and there's an array of work still to be done. So for me, this area of care is vitally important that we pioneer new initiatives and we celebrate and in fact we network as we are today what good looks like, and particularly if we're going to continue to grow and enhance how we support people effectively and during and throughout the palliative care journey. What I want to do in the next few slides is offer some key principles in relation to the role that learning disability nurses make in this area of care. In terms of my position currently, I do have the opportunity and have had previous opportunities working nationally to be able to see an array of innovation across the country and beyond, and bring that together, both in terms of my own thinking, but also recognising what other people are doing to capture the work that they do and to describe it. So what I've done here in these next few slides is try to describe that learning and those ideas to set out hopefully what this might mean for learning disability nurses and the learning disability nursing profession. So in thinking about the role that learning disability nurses play within the area of palliative care, I just want to offer a few pointers here. They are by no means exhaustive, but hopefully will give colleagues food for thought, and in many cases will give anchor points to what you yourselves are already thinking about and understand to be some of your role and function. In the first instance here, I wanted to emphasise the role of learning disability nurses serving as primary facilitators for some of the care that's required during the palliative care journey. And in many ways, learning disability nurses remain the go-to professional. They possess the ready resources often, and certainly that level of understanding to be able to help people and families navigate through services. If we think about particularly the key worker principle, then in this case, learning disability nurses often are able to assure this function and deliver it well, because importantly, as learning disability nurses, we do see the whole person and often understand the whole picture because we're right in the middle of it, both from the perspective of services helping to deliver care for a person, to the family home, to the person themselves, their thoughts, wishes and feelings. And that's such a critical link to service when thinking how services interact and support and prepare and adjust their care in order to meet the person's very often individualised needs during the palliative care journey and those of the family. So when we think about the flexibility of our role as learning disability nurses, I often talk about this, and for me it's part of what I would describe as an unwritten element of our roles, because it's something that we don't often shout loud enough about. And I am sure in fact that we've all worked with or know or met colleagues who are resistant to flexing or adjusting their roles and remits to accommodate the needs, wishes, wants and desires of the individual and their families. But I would argue learning disability nurses are extremely well placed in doing just that, because they readily do it in everyday practice, because the concept of holistic working fits extremely well with how learning disability nurses operate and the environments in which they do so. So at a time when services, as we know, are facing increasing levels of pressure and constraints, this is such an important value and means by which, as learning disability nurses, we operate to ensure that people receive high quality, effective care. This next point links intrinsically with the other points being made here, and that's something about the ability learning disability nurses have to engage and sustain in long-term relationships with people and their families. As we know, palliative care is in fact support critical, I would describe it as. The emotive nature of the work does consistently require both responsive and compassionate support for people, and I would suggest that where required, it often needs fair and just forms of mediation. Again, we know that levels of satisfaction from reported by people and their families about learning disability nurses is extremely high. So when it comes to negotiating with others, organising care, and sometimes challenging very difficult decisions, learning disability nurses are extremely well placed to do this. As expert practitioners, we do absolutely serve an extremely critical role in what we deliver, but this is just one facet of what we do so well as learning disability nurses, and I would suggest we hold a very privileged position of being able to have a bird's eye view of the overall care that the person might be receiving or requires, in fact. And having this perspective allows us to confidently represent what might be in the person's best interests, and that's often to facilitate in the design or the support and treatment that a person requires, whilst always ensuring that the care itself is designed and co-created with the person and their family in the centre. And that, of course, includes relevant other colleagues, professionals or support agents. So in this next slide, I want to kind of present an illustration of an outline model for how we might construct some of these ideas about the contribution that learning disabilities nurses make, and how that ultimately feeds into what should be a level of excellence in the care that we deliver. There are three stages to this construct, and the first bubble you see there talks about how we might seek to achieve what it is that we're actually looking to deliver and how we might evaluate the impact of this. And if we do that well, that is the bedrock of the assurance that we'll be offering when we deliver any form of care, let alone that which we deliver during palliative care journeys and episodes. So whilst we might know what the overarching goal is that we're seeking to achieve, it's often the smaller, more discrete areas of care in those episodes that can be the most challenging. So in setting out, if you like, to provide excellence in what we deliver, I would suggest we need to have in mind how we're going to realise that overarching ambition of excellence in palliative care, but also, and importantly, from an assurance point of view, how are we going to review that? How often will we review it? Who will be party to that review in order to evaluate its effects and the impact that we have? It probably sounds more complicated than it is, but it's a really important cornerstone of the work that we're seeking to effectively prescribe. In this next bubble, the middle point I make here is that around what does palliative care expertise actually look like on the part of learning disability nurses, and I think we would all agree that high quality palliative care must always be founded in humanity, and that being kindness and and compassion, but with I would say an absolute willingness to ensure that we serve as a respectful a role as we possibly can during and throughout that period. And as individual circumstances and their needs change during that period, so too will the role of the learning disability nurse and the application of the skills and expertise that they bring. So this element is really important, that we define what constitutes that contribution. It's particularly important. This third point around how we understand and apply the evidence that we use in the roles and the work that we assume is really, really important. And the value of that and the quality of the evidence that we use to plan for and deliver good, high quality palliative care, it has to be fundamental to the roles that learning disability nurses assume within this journey. In this instance, I would suggest it serves to showcase how learning disability nurses lead in people's palliative care journeys, but also helps to describe how they deploy their expertise as health teachers by using that evidence that we talk about to advocate for people at times, to perhaps explain a given approach, or dare I say it, to inspire confidence that we absolutely fully understand all it is that we prescribe and we deliver. And in the round, bringing those three areas together creates the bedrock for excellence in palliative care. Just a few descriptors here in red that I'm offering, I'm sure will be familiar to most of you joining and listening to this presentation, and I guess many of you will have at times assumed these very positions, but it's important when we think about a model like this and bringing together all of it in one construct, that we're able to eloquently convey what we do. So whether we are those supporters to the family and the person, and we're there in their deepest, darkest hour of need, whether we are the mediators to sometimes emotive and often what might be difficult circumstances, decisions, then we readily adopt that role. We are undoubtedly the clinical experts in this, and we know and understand the parameters in which we operate, but really important to be able to describe that. And of course, these roles and expertise will differ in everyone's journey, dependent on circumstances, need, and other factors. But it's just really important to be able to outline these to effectively back up, if you like, the model that we kind of set out here. In this next slide, I want to just expand upon the points made in the first section of the model, which is how we provide the assurance for delivering excellence in palliative care. And the image here I've chosen, I hope, resonates with everyone viewing the presentation, in that its messaging is both powerful, but also something that we would, I'm sure, any healthcare professional, aside from learning disability nurses, would uphold as their mantra when supporting people and the families during this period. The points I raise here and I've outlined, again, are by no means exhaustive. They are fundamental principles, and if anything, I would suggest they are there to serve as an aid memoir to some of the excellent work that we do and deliver as learning disability nurses. And I'll just touch upon each of these. The importance of planning the support and the interventions, as we talked about prior, is so important when we think about palliative care, because there is due sensitivity required. And of course, always do we need to think about a reasonably adjusted care for people and adopting the principle of reasonable adjustments. And as we talk about this in the slide around our expertise, understanding this at this point and how reasonably adjusted care is a person's right is absolutely critical and can be critical to the care they go on to receive. Having an evidence base, being able to describe the evidence base and effectively deploy what it is that you're hoping to achieve is critical in this work. And if we are to achieve best practice, by doing this and applying it and understanding it, then it does help to a degree to define some of our accountability. The element of quality and the need and the value of auditing what we do is really important, and I know many of you will be doing this in the work that you do and the initiatives that you lead, but I've been keen to emphasize here that developmentally or otherwise we start somewhere with the work that we do in any area of care, and in the realms of palliative care I think we do lead that change, and we have led that change, and collectively if we combine our efforts to describe the high level outputs we've achieved for people and the difference it's made, and a lot of that will come from testimony from people during that time, but also afterwards from family members, I'm sure it would resonate with each of us, the power and the value and the impact of what we've achieved for and with the person. Being able to be clear, and I've put confident there because that's equally as important, in understanding what we're seeking to achieve is really important, and I can't emphasize this enough. If we think about adverse incidents where things have gone terribly wrong, and unfortunately I have to look at this an awful lot in my day-to-day work, it's often been due to a lack of rationale where the individual clinician has failed to be clear about and been able to readily articulate what their intended aim is. And they've not particularly set out an effective rationale that has a good evidence base, or been able to describe how they hoped something would be delivered. So it's left arrangements at times being somewhat ad hoc, and actually, and sadly in some cases, adverse consequences for the person being cared for. So this clear and confident approach to our work in order to provide high level assurance is really important. And the last point there about utilising and adopting and being able to apply recognised methods and tools around quality improvement is critical in this work, in all of our work in fact. But if we do that in designing and co-designing that with people and the families, and we're able to account it as a credible method, then it will help when it comes to evaluation, because I'm sure, as colleagues know, many of the quality improvement methods and tools and approaches have within them a built-in evaluation mechanism. So it helps in the overall approach we take to understanding how effective our input has been. When we think about the unique contribution that learning disability nurses make in care generally, aside from palliative care, then it becomes at times quite a contentious point. Many learning disability nurses will often tell me that they struggle to, or in fact strive to, describe what that unique contribution is. So the variance is huge, and we perhaps need to get to a point where we can readily illustrate and convey to people what it is that we bring, and of course expanding upon that in different areas of care. For the purpose of describing some of these unique contributions, I've just put here a few points that are merely a sample, if you like, of what could be a whole list of exemplary skills, roles and abilities that we possess. But I'll just go through these briefly to convey key points around how we achieve this for people, and in this instance how we might do this within the palliative care journey. Point number one in the bottom left, the first bubble, I've been keen to convey the importance of us delivering support and interventions that are always sensitive and adjusted to the needs of the individual, and actually are able, or our role and function, we're readily able to challenge both inequalities and discrimination that we might come across. And for me, that's something about our role in upholding and respecting and preserving people's rights. Many colleagues talk to me about facing more battles than they do harmonious relations in these examples, but actually in finding a way through and holding true to the principles of rights, they actually become lead agents, and that's an invaluable part of what contribution a learning disability nurse makes in an array of different areas of care. In the next point here around using our array of expertise to help the person and the family during the palliative care episode, and describing and being able to describe what it is that we're providing, is a really essential component of our role as health teachers and the educative function that we use. And I would argue this is both a critical but an essential part of what we need to do in any example or case of specific elements of care. And in doing so, the direct consequence of this, if we do it well, is that we know it inspires confidence in the people receiving the care, so the person and the family feel much more supported. And as a result, trust is built and trust is formed. So the importance of this should never be underestimated. The top point here is perhaps one of the main areas where we have been able to convey to our audience as learning disability nurses where we excel. The whole concept of person-centeredness, individualized care, and dare I say it, the personalization agenda speaks very powerfully to what we've been doing for many decades. So it's a fundamental part of how we do and perform the work that we do. So that person and family first approach that I talk about here, particularly in palliative care, is essential, because care will undoubtedly need to be designed and delivered at times in partnership. And if it can be achieved throughout, then it can only be for the better. And whilst I'm perhaps stating the obvious, engaging people like this at the outset and making them equal partners does in turn empower them. And it invites, in many cases, their ability and their own confidence to be able to feed back to us as practitioners. And sometimes that feedback's constructive, and sometimes actually, you know, it might be negative, but that's where the learning cycle ensues. And so the whole concept of working in co-production with people to learn and understand how we can improve in the round is really, really important. And in the palliative care journey or episodes of care relating to such, that has to be such a critical focus of our work. Another part of our unique contribution and the skill set that we bring is that of the role of facilitation. And, you know, for a number of years, we've talked about and described our role as kind of health facilitators. And in this instance, the merits of this speak very powerfully to engaging people, bringing folks together and informing the care that's being delivered. And that in turn, if it's done effectively, it brings about that whole concept of being able to illustrate what good holistic care and approaches look like. And as I mentioned earlier, the learning disability nurse, as we do readily adapt and flex to so many varied circumstances. And that in itself is quite exceptional, because by doing this, we hold a unique position and an ability, if you like, within it to bring people together. And it's that bringing together, sometimes it's quite disparate, as we know, when people aren't working together or there's more greater coordination needed, that's critical in delivering good and effective holistic care that speaks to and is accountable to the person themselves. In this latter point around coordinating certain procedural aspects of care, and I've cited here the Mental Capacity Act and best interest processes, etc. The learning disability nurse often is the lead agent in helping to bring this together. And in the palliative care scenario, it can be extremely important that the lead role is taken by the learning disability nurse to facilitate that. And it's a really important consideration that needs to be made, because assisting in the procedural aspects of care is often a fundamental part of bringing together the other elements of what the person needs, and certainly helping navigate through some of the difficult situations that people find themselves in. So whilst these can sometimes be challenging, they do remain an extremely important aspect of our role in helping to understand and deliver the best outputs, using, in this instance, some of the legal and statutory frameworks that exist to achieve it. In this penultimate slide, I just wanted to offer a few points around how we assimilate and integrate the evidence that we use into the practice that we then go on to deliver. And I won't talk to each of these points. Again, they are a sample of an array of qualities and skills and expertise that we bring, but they are important considerations to make when thinking about how we understand what it is that we deliver, and absolutely how we apply it in clinical practice. If I was to account this as a mantra and taking key points from each of these bubbles, I would be saying learning disability nurses are excellent at embracing new learning and responding to circumstances, often where there might be a lack of evidence, but working intuitively to the best of their ability to achieve good outcomes for people. We do, when we are research mindedness, we can only strengthen that as we move forward, and in doing so, that does give validation to how we approach certain aspects of care. As subject matter experts, which of course we are, there's something about our role and our duty to be able to share collectively what it is that we know, how we use it in order to teach others, and for people and families to engage them in understanding what it is that we're doing in order to invite them in to be part of the process. In this final slide, I've used this photograph here, hopefully as a means of reinforcing what we all feel as professionals in our own right, and particularly focused on learning disability nursing, that passion did absolutely lead us to where we are now, some 102 years into our profession. But the final words I want to give over to direct quotations that I've taken from an investigation I was involved in, and these are the words of a parent. Caring for a loved one who has a terminal illness is hard enough, but when you have to worry about whether they will receive good quality end of life care, which is free from discrimination, it becomes much harder. If we hadn't had the input of the learning disability nurse, then it would have been so much more challenging. She provided emotional support and helped us to understand lots of different processes. She also stood up to a particularly ignorant doctor at one of our appointments. And using those points raised earlier, those descriptors, these are some of the powerful, hopefully powerful reminders of what we do as learning disability nurses in many different sets of circumstances. Clearly, in this instance, the input of the learning disability nurse was particularly significant to this family. And if we think about the slides thus far, actually, yes, they did challenge and tackle and address discrimination. They did provide the humanity that's expected. They did facilitate and coordinate care. And ultimately, the output was one of resolution for the family, which is always a good thing and can only be a good thing. But a difference was made. And in your day-to-day work, I'm sure you're able to recount many instances where the impact of what you do has made a significant difference. So I want to thank colleagues for being part of today and this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm more than happy to take questions via email, as unfortunately I can't make the end of the day question and answer session. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, and unfortunately, David can't be with us for the Q&A this afternoon. So I just echo Peter's thanks to you, David, for sharing your wisdom with us. That was a very full morning, and I think we're ready now for our 15-minute break, you think?
Okay, yep. So get yourself a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, and see you all back at 11:30. Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, nice to see you back again. And we will now have the first 3 of today's conference papers. And we will start with Dr. Thomas Fretwell.
His talk is called The Adult Neurodisability MDT, Improving Advanced Care Planning in Those Complex Conditions.
So hello, my name's Tom Fretwell and I'm a chest doctor working at the RVI in Newcastle. And I'm going to talk to you today about a project I've been involved with, which is the kind of development and rollout of an adult neurodisability MDT. And as far as we're aware, this is the first of its kind in adult services. So I couldn't list everyone who's been involved here in this presentation, but here are some of those involved and the authors of this presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you about why we did this, how we've been running the neurodisability MDT, the results from an initial pilot focusing on advanced care planning, and just for a few thoughts for the future of how we're planning to further improve the neurodisability MDT. So why? The LEADER programme's annual review into deaths in those with learning disability has showed multiple ways in which the care of patients with a learning disability needs to be improved. Frequently it shows that poor coordination of care and fragmented care in adult services contributes to poor outcomes. And it's made a number of recommendations over the years that includes the development of multidisciplinary team working, timely referral to specialists, timely advanced care planning, timely end-of-life care planning. And really, I guess our response to those recommendations was trying to create this meeting as we felt we could address some of the issues from the LEADER report through this. And what we've been doing is we've been having bi-monthly meetings where we discuss patients that have a neurodisability. We have dedicated slots for those who are soon to transition or going through the transition process from child services to adult services. And the bulk of the meeting is to discuss new patients and to review patients that are known to the team. And just to make it clear, this isn't just for medical issues, this is for a variety of medical, psychological and social issues that might be part of the care. And at the end, we have a time for a mortality review where we can reflect and learn from cases discussed, and also it's a time to see if any further bereavement support is needed for families. And who's involved in the MDT? There's a really wide range of professionals in this MDT, including hospital and community-based palliative care specialists, learning disability specialists, doctors and nurse specialists from intensive care, respiratory, home ventilation, neurology, PEG specialists, input from community and general paediatricians and further wider community team. And I think what struck me the first time I attended one of these meetings was that these specialists are very commonly needed in the care of someone, especially someone with a severe neurodisability. But it's very rare you'd actually see all of these people in one room where shared decision making can be done quickly and with a wide discussion with all the necessary specialists. I think that just shows why care is often fragmented and why patients often report problems such as feeling like there's a lack of ownership, that the system's slow, and it's maybe not as holistic as what they've experienced in child services. And I guess by doing this, what we were aiming to do was improve communication between specialties, that we would improve and be able to deliver rapid shared decision making involving multiple specialists involved in someone's care, especially someone's care who's very complex. And we're hoping that this meeting will allow us to take ownership of our patients more, because that's a frequent response people have to adult care, that there's lots of individual specialists who don't talk to each other. And because there isn't that central general paediatrician they had in child services, I feel that's lacking. And we really was aiming to bring everyone together to give a more holistic approach to care. And generally, we're just hoping that the service will become more cohesive during the transition process, throughout a patient's life and at the end of their life. So now I'm just going to talk to you about the initial pilot results, and this was really a focus on advanced care planning. So after the first 4 meetings, we discussed 22 patients' care. There was 1 transition to patients' care discussed, and 3 deaths were reviewed. And of the patients discussed, as a result of these meetings, 64% went on to have an emergency healthcare plan written if they did not already have one. And 23% of patients had palliative care put initiated if it was not already in place. And 50% of patients had their social support in some way altered or improved. And this could be from an alteration to their care or actually respite care. And then looking in more detail at the emergency healthcare plans that were created as a result of this meeting, we really wanted to ensure that they were clinically useful. And then I just want to make it clear that all of these were written in conjunction with the patient and their relatives. And so 89% of the emergency healthcare plans written contain recommendations about CPR or escalation to intensive care in the event of someone's death or deterioration. If the patient had epilepsy, all the HCPs created contain a plan of how to manage the seizure at home or in hospital. And anyone who had problems with their chest, such as chest infections, needing a ventilator, needing a cough assist machine, 100% of those patients had a clear management plan what to do, from what to do with their equipment, for what to do with antibiotics, and when to need hospital admission. And probably most importantly, 100% of these emergency health care plans created contained a paragraph that was written from the perspective of the patient in conjunction with the patient's family that was describing the quality of life and functioning of the patient. And we think this is really important for many reasons, but one is it can be very difficult when you meet someone when they present acutely unwell to hospital to get a good understanding of their kind of background, their role in the family, their quality of life, especially if they're so unwell they can't communicate or can't communicate anyway. So we think that's really important. We also surveyed all the members of the MDT to ask them what they thought about the MDT generally, but also what they thought about the emergency healthcare plans we created. And essentially everyone agreed that the new disability would improve the care of our patients. And everyone either agreed, and nearly 80% of MDT members strongly agreed that the emergency healthcare plans were written in a way that would help the acute medical team, to which the patient isn't known to, look after them with an acute medical problem. And so I guess looking back overall, we feel that our neurodisability MDT has added value to our patients' care. And we really think it is going to act as a mechanism within our hospital to address the recommendations of the lead report and further recommendations in the future. We're still aiming to improve the meeting. It's still a very fluid process. We're hoping to get more engagement from GPs, get GPs directly involved in the meetings and get all the outcomes from the meetings. Because obviously for a lot of patients, the GP is the first person they see when they're unwell, not hospital specialists. We're also looking at ways of further smoothing out transition process involving transition pathways. I guess importantly, we're hoping to inspire other people to get involved in these meetings and to take an interest into looking after patients with learning disability. So if we don't inspire other people, we're not going to be able to make all these changes. And thank you, and that's me done. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me on thomas.fratwell1@nhs.net. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Thomas. The next paper is presented by Professor Stuart Todd.
Yeah, and his paper is titled The Last Days of Life in 12 Months of COVID-19, Patterns of Death and Dying in Care Settings for Adults with Learning Disabilities in the UK.
Hello, I'm Stuart Todd from the University of South Wales, and I'd like to present some initial findings I'm doing with colleagues across the UK. The names of my colleagues are mentioned here, and I'd like to thank them, but it would take me more than 10 minutes to read out their names. It's a study of the impact of COVID-19 on patterns of death and dying of people with learning disabilities living in care homes and supported living settings for people with learning disabilities across the UK. It's a UK study, and the people that I'm working with come from universities and organisations across the 4 countries of the UK. Before I begin, I really do need to provide a warning. This study isn't yet finished. We still have lots of information to collect, lots more information to make sense of. So what I'm saying here right now might change in the short-term future. So please be careful and cautious about using the findings from this study, and do get in touch with me if you'd like to keep in touch with the progress and eventual findings from the study. We know that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on people living in care homes, but usually when we think of care homes, these are care homes and nursing homes for older people. What about learning disability care homes? There are many of them, and many adults with learning disabilities will live in their adult years in some kind of learning disability care setting, and they're quite different from care homes for older people. They are much smaller, maybe somewhere from 1 to 6 people on average might be living in a learning disability care setting, and they're much younger than people living in care homes for older people, often by perhaps 30 years or so younger. Yet it does seem that living in any kind of care setting is likely, and there's some evidence to suggest this, will increase risk of a negative outcome of a COVID-19 infection. And added to that, maybe that people living in care settings may also, although they are younger, may also have underlying health conditions that also increase this risk. And so what we wanted to do in this study was actually to be able to determine the level, the changed levels and risk of mortality. And we thought we could partly answer that by repeating some aspects of the study that was conducted in 2014-2015, the last days of life study, and the reference for that are at the end of this presentation. But that allows us to have a point of comparison. So we repeated some aspects of the study. We contacted organisations and asked if they'd like to take part, and if they agreed, we asked them to describe their supported population living in registered care homes and supported living settings, and describe them in terms of their age and sex and place of residence. This means that we can look at differences in the two populations, or the population across 2 different periods of time, and to make sure that we are comparing like with like. It's a population-based study, and that's one of its strengths. But we have to make sure that the 2 populations are largely equivalent, or we can control for changes. Now, up to recently, 12 services have completed phase 1. They described that population, and I'll be able to present that data. And they also recorded and reported the number of deaths that had taken place between the 1st of March 2020 and the 28th of February 2021. And so far we have data that 88 deaths have been reported to us. The next phase of the study is we get some individual data on those deaths and on those individual deaths, for example, people's age, gender, their cause of death, month of death, and length of last illness. And I got some data to present in this presentation as well. And then finally, we'll do some follow-up qualitative interviews in October and November this year, and hopefully the study will be finished by the end of the year. So, are the 2 populations different? Are the populations different at 2 points in time? And largely, as we can see, they are broadly comparable. If there's anything, there's a slight change for the population to be older in 2021 than it was in 2014. The average age of people living in settings was 48 in 2014 and was 52 in 2020. So there is some indication that the populations are slightly similar, if just a little bit older. certainly what we did find is there have been quite dramatic changes in the rate of mortality in this population. Quite huge differences. The first two columns are registered care homes, the next two columns supported living settings, and the last two columns are the data combined. The overall death rate increased from about 11 to 12 people per 1,000 people supported to just over 30 deaths per 1,000 people supported. That's 2.5 times higher, and that's huge. And what we can also clearly see is that the impact was probably greater in supported living settings than registered care homes, where there were almost 3 times as many deaths during the months of the pandemic. And if we have time, we might care to consider why that is. Also, we will be looking at also age-specific death rates to find out where the peak changes in mortality. But there's some indication from the data already that men perhaps were slightly more at risk at the moment, and that people with Down syndrome were more represented in the deceased population in 2021 compared to 2015. And we'll be looking at that again in more detail as we collect more data. There was some consistency in our data regarding place of death. Registered care settings for people and adults with learning disabilities are places for living, but they are also importantly places of death. For many people, it will be the last place of residence, and for half of the people in our study, it was actually the place of death as well. And there's some consistency there. Where there was changes was in the patterns of how people were dying, and that's useful to think of in terms of the provision of end-of-life care, and that there were much fewer deaths in 2021 from an illness that lasted 6 months or more before death. And many more deaths were taking place where there was less, and the illness was less of a month's duration. So there's much shorter deaths. Staff in these services, they're dealing with more deaths, and they're dealing with different deaths. They're dealing with, if you like, shorter periods of dying, and we might care to think about those as difficult deaths. Why is this happening? Well, the answer is not probably surprising. The cause of death. In our study, almost 4 in 10 deaths involved confirmed or suspected COVID-19 infection. It was the biggest cause of death in the population in 2021. But it doesn't explain all the excess deaths that we seem to have seen previously. Why is that? Well, remember that we do have a slightly older population. And so we might naturally expect there would have been an increase in mortality, and at the same time there may also have been some of the indirect causes of the pandemic, which is about restricted access to healthcare, which may in itself have led to an increase in premature mortality, and we'll be able to look at that from the data that we have. That's a very brief overview of the study. Please remember the warning that I gave, that the study is not yet finished, and the findings that we have are probably likely to change over the next month or so. What have we found? We found, as expected, an increased level of mortality directly because of COVID-19, but we did not expect to see such a differential impact on supported living settings. And I think there are some questions to try and answer about why that is. After all, supported living settings, they're probably slightly smaller again in registered care homes. There's a slightly younger population, and there's some evidence to suggest that the population of people in supported living settings may generally have fewer underlying health conditions. But on the other hand, maybe those two populations are beginning to merge. And we do know that deregistration has happened, so that some care homes are now becoming supported living settings, and so the populations are just becoming more distinct. And also there may be some problems in staffing. There are higher, more intensive staffing in supported living settings than in care homes, we found from previous work. And the pattern of staffing may also be different. Perhaps staff in supported living settings are more mobile, working between settings, have a much more mobile and flexible workforce. And that itself might come with some risk. So that's really a very brief summary. Here are some of the sources that people, if you want to, look at some of the work we've done previously and you can understand the method that we've employed. Please do follow this up, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
Yeah, thanks. That was fascinating. Thank you. Almost lunchtime, but before we break for lunch, we will hear from our very own Gemma Allen with Dr. Jed Jerwood and Dudley Voices for Choice.
Please present their project, No Barriers Here, Advanced Care Planning and People with Intellectual Disabilities.
Yeah. And I think Vince and Sam, who are part of the grassroots group, are in that as well. So we might spot them in the presentation. Let's wait and see. Over to you all.
Hello, my name's Gemma Allen. I'm back again. In addition to being the chair of PCPLD Network, I'm also the Diversity and Inclusion Lead at the Mary Stevens Hospice. And we wanted to share with you our project around advanced care planning and people with learning disabilities. This is called No Barriers Here. No Barriers Here is completely co-produced and co-developed with people with learning disabilities, and that includes the sharing of our work. So I'm going to hand over to Vince now, who will tell you a bit about the project steering group, and then he will be sharing with you our video.
Hello, my name is Vince. I'm a member of the No Barriers Here steering group. Dudley Voices for Choice works in co-production with the Mary Stevens Hospice and Jed Jerwood to break down barriers for people with learning disabilities. We wanted people with learning disabilities to have equal opportunities to talk about the end of life. This is how we did it.
No Barriers Here explores advanced care planning for people with learning disabilities. It is co-produced and co-developed, and it uses artist approaches to really have these creative conversations around what people want and what people don't want at the end of life. We actually held the first 2 cohorts of workshops during the UK lockdowns because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know from previous research that people with learning disabilities are often disadvantaged when trying to access palliative and end-of-life care. It can be due to unidentified health needs. It can often be through a lack of knowledge from healthcare professionals that they may not understand people's needs. It could also be through barriers to communication as well. So No Barriers Here looked at how we could take advanced care planning conversations away from a medicalised environment, and we wanted to let people know that it's okay to talk about death and dying, that it's okay to plan for the end of life, whether you have a learning disability or not.
I think it's very, very important that everybody with autism and learning disabilities have their own decisions about what they want and how they, how they want their later life care to be. Because at the end of the day, it's their lives, it's their wishes, it's their choice, it's their right. And it's very important that they are all met. And I wanted really, I suppose, to get my voice heard. So that's why I decided to join up and just see what difference I could make, I guess, to people's lives, really. Sometimes creative workshops are a good way of communicating, and sometimes people are not always comfortable with talking, so sometimes drawing things and just making things, sometimes it's another good way of like interacting and sometimes expressing your feelings and emotions if you're not too comfortable with talking to people face to face. I certainly find it's easier to talk as a group because after all, you are all in the same boat, sort of thing.
So when we think about advanced care planning, there's lots of decisions and things and conversations that you have to have. So what we're going to do is each week we're going to sort of tackle a different part of this. We're all going to create a kind of like an advanced care plan, and people have really personal, individual ideas about what's important. And if we share them, they're much more likely to happen. So if we talk to people around us, we're much more likely to get the care that we'd like, you know, if possible.
My sister's important to me. And then I've got DVC who I can talk to, and I've got my support workers who I can talk to as well.
My son is important to me, Jamie. And my other son is important to me, Simon.
I've got friends on there, even though I haven't got many. And I've got some family members because I don't talk to all of them.
I'm a sport worker and Mrs. Dear. I'm important to me at the minute. I'm important to me.
But obviously independence is very, very important, and I'd like to try and maintain as much of that as I can.
I used to live in the countryside years ago.
Yeah.
I live in the countryside.
So if you were kind of poorly and coming towards the end of your life, would it be important to be able to be taken outside if you couldn't take yourself outside?
Yep.
If I get sick and I'm dying, I still want to do all the things I'm doing now. So I want to go shopping in my wheelchair.
I would like to be at home with all my family.
I want to die in my own bed, and whether I want anybody around me, I don't know. I haven't decided on that. Yeah, I don't quite fancy a hospital bed.
Yeah, I want to be cremated.
You said about the curtains closed.
You want them to be closed when the coffin goes down or in?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
A rainbow coffin?
Okay.
A rainbow hearse?
Yeah.
And obviously, you know what that is. That is the LGBT flag.
Well, hopefully, obviously, being helpful and kind with others.
I want them to remember me by sometimes when I'm at work, they said I don't know what we do without you.
And I speak up at DVC.
So you've been as an advocate.
And I like to be remembered of all the doctors and nurses that were trained, 255 of them.
I think it's made me accept it more, because I think I've learned to accept that it's going to happen one day.
I've never done this before, but it's really good.
It's really great, I think, how, you know, we can share things and feel safe to do that.
It's quite hard, you know, getting to know what you actually want when you die. You know, it's not something that you think about at the start. Then, like when you're doing things, you actually think about it. This is important to me. This is what I want. You know, it's not all about, you know, about me dying. It's about what I want in life.
Thank you, everybody. If you would like more information about No Barriers here and about the trainer package that we've since developed, please do get in touch with me. You can email me or you can contact me on Twitter. And just to show you that obviously the film had to be filmed online, but the final face-to-face workshop we managed to do face-to-face, and unfortunately it was too late to include the content of that within the film. And the picture in front of you is actually some of the artwork from the third workshop that has been put together and now forms a community piece of artwork that will be on display within the West Midlands. Thank you.
This ends our morning sessions. Thank you for your attention so far. We will now have a lunch break.
And this actual session will end, and to get into the afternoon session, you will need to click on the separate afternoon link that hopefully you'll have been sent. We'll start promptly at 12:45 with some great poster presentations. But if you join us a bit earlier, then you'll be able to see some of the highlights from the PCPLD network during this past year.
Enjoy your lunch and see you later. Bon appetit.
Oh, eet smakelijk. That's Dutch. Means the same thing. I'll see you later.